This video will help you review and grade your answer to the pizza question on breach. So the first thing to do is watch this video, then use the posted grading guide to grade your own answer. Or you could exchange and grade the answer of a colleague's, which would give you the advantage of getting another person's viewpoint on your answer. Then, if you rewrite your answer, submit the original answer, the grading sheet, and your rewrite with an explanation of what you changed, I will review your answer. So let's take a look at what the question asks you to do. First, did you think that there was a breach? Yes or no? This was a very close call. Your grade on this exercise would not depend on whether you answered yes or no. I think the better argument is no, but it's the quality of your analysis that matters, not the conclusion you reached. Let's focus on the question itself. Remember that in an exam it's important to think before you write so that you can allocate your time and space wisely. So first, read the question. Here the question expressly asks you to address breach and in fact tells you not to address any other elements. So we know the issue we're going to address is breach. The second thing we should realize is that we have 30 minutes, but that the fact pattern demands a lot of analysis and a lot of issues. So we're going to have to decide which boxes or which parts of breach are going to require a lot of analysis, are going to explode, and which parts will be relatively easy to do. So did you think about that before you wrote your answer? We know that there are actually two steps within breach. The first step is to refine the standard of care. The question tells us that we should be applying reasonable care. Right? The question says Marvin concedes he owes Robin a duty of reasonable care. But the first question we have to ask is, what factors come into play when we refine the standard of care for this fact pattern? What's a reasonable person in this fact pattern? What are the circumstances we can take into account? The second part of breach is whether this defendant actually did fail to exercise reasonable care. When you looked at this fact pattern, you should have realized that refining here was relatively straightforward. You should do it in one paragraph because indeed there was only one attribute of the defendant which required mention. In contrast, you should have realized that whether the defendant breached the duty required extensive analysis and should take up most of your paper. Your analysis in discussing whether the defendant did breach this duty should focus on option A, the risk utility case. Most of the time when we run a reasonable care breach analysis, we're going to compare the risks of the existing conduct and the utility of the existing conduct with an alternative conduct we suggest the defendant should take. There is an argument that maybe you should use custom here, but because there's a little bit of information about what the other stores do. However, we should realize that the predominant focus of our answer should be risk utility. We should also realize that we are not discussing res ipsa loquitur. Remember, res ipsa loquitur is only triggered when we don't know defendant's conduct. Here, by contrast, we have a lot of information about what defendant did, so we should not be discussing res ipsa loquitur. How would we write an answer that addressed breach? Let's take a look at the grading guide I provided for you. Right at the top, I suggest how you should go about grading your own answer, or if you've exchanged it, grade someone else's. At this point, you want to pull out the grading guide, which I've posted online, and follow along. The first thing your answer should do is identify the big issue at stake. So this is given to you by the question. Is summary judgment appropriate because defendant did not breach? And as your rule, you would simply want to explain that negligence requires the proof of breach as an essential element, as well as injury and causation. Having identified the big issue, you would then start into the first of the two breach boxes, right? Refining the standard of care. Your rule statement should simply be that reasonable care is the care of a reasonable person in the same or similar circumstances, and your rule analysis would look for attributes of the defendant which would be moved over under the reasonable person rule. The only attribute you should note here is the superior knowledge rule, that we do take into account superior knowledge when asking if a defendant exercised reasonable care. And the facts that you should link right here are that Marvin knew about the pizza being dropped given the complaints and injuries, so the standard we're going to hold him to is the care of a reasonable person who knows about the pizza problem. Again, notice we're exercising our strategy, summarized here in green. One very quick paragraph, as defendant only has one special attribute. And notice this section does not ask you to apply the reasonable care standard. In other words, you're not asking right here if the defendant met the standard. You're just making sure you know exactly what the standard looks like in this fact pattern. So we come out of one understanding that we're going to apply the reasonable care of someone who has knowledge of the pizzas. So let's now try and ascertain under heading number 2 whether the defendant did indeed breach this duty. If you remember, we decided this would have an extensive analysis. Here's the strategy that I suggest we use when you're facing a complex breach analysis. If you remember, our first step was to identify the existing versus the alternative conduct. Then we had to assess the risks and burdens posed by each. First, identifying the alternative conduct. Here, the question gives you the suggested alternative conduct, because the question says that Marvin's motion argues that Robin is unable to prove that Marvin breached this duty by using wax paper. In addition, the fact pattern provides you information that the other alternative he considered was using ceramic plates. Therefore, your answer should focus on whether he lacked reasonable care in going with wax paper instead of going with ceramic plates and a seating area. 2. You're going to then try and write a series of RACs, rule analysis conclusion, on the risks posed first by the existing conduct. So remember, our strategy when running a risk utility is to first look at the existing conduct and ask what kind of risk did it pose, and then look at the alternative conduct and ask, did this lower the risk? What kind of burden was attached to it? And then ask if there was some kind of lost utility as part of the burden. Finally, we'd look to see if there was any new risks posed by the plates, or as you will note, we could include that as part of the discussion above. And then we'd have a conclusion. So let's work our way through this analysis. Remember, as we do it, each factor, P and L, is in fact a rule that you're going to state and apply. So the first thing you'd need to do is explain the risk utility concept. Okay? Let's go into our analysis. First, we're going to analyze the risk posed by an existing conduct. We want to look at the probability of harm and the gravity of harm that the existing conduct poses. Here are a whole list of facts which you should have mentioned to enable you to predict that there is a high probability of harm if Marvin continues with his existing conduct of using wax paper. You should also have used these facts to suggest that the gravity of the harm or the seriousness of the injuries is not that high. This would lead you to reach a conclusion about what the risk is, what the P times L, probability and gravity of harm is, from the existing conduct. At this point, we suggest the alternative conduct, which is in the fact pattern, the use of ceramic plates. Remember, when we look at the alternative conduct, there's two big things we have to ask. Does it lower the risk? If the alternative conduct does not lower the risk, then no one is going to say that the defendant should have taken these additional precautions. We'll also want to look at the burden posed. So our inquiry first is whether the additional precaution that we are suggesting that Marvin had to take using ceramic plates will actually lower the risk of harm to customers. You want to work out what the impact of the precaution is on both the probability of harm and on the likely gravity of the harm. When you look at precautions, the precaution's impact on probability, the precaution will cause a much lower probability of injury because the fact pattern specifically tells you that few people will take pizza into the aisles and most will sit at tables. Therefore, the likelihood of spills in the aisles causing falls is much lower. A counter that you could raise in a really good argument would be that plates are cumbersome, so maybe there will be more drops and debris even if fewer people take it into the aisle. The second thing you want to look about the existing risk is whether the precaution changes the gravity or seriousness of the existing conduct. What's interesting is that if people in fact take the plates into the aisles, you may well see higher gravity because broken plates on the ground create potential for more serious injuries to the dropper and the shopper compared with simply paper on the ground. Now notice right here, you could, if you wish, treat the threat of injury from the plates as a new risk. So you could simply conclude that the risk of falls goes down, but there's a new risk of cutting on ceramic plates. That's a perfectly acceptable way of analyzing this. Right here, you need to sum up what your argument is for the jury. So your likely conclusion is that the precautions, the alternative conduct you're saying Marvin would have to take, will reduce the probability of falls very drastically. However, it does create a potential for more serious injuries if you start seeing broken plates in the aisle. So the alternative does not offer a strong improvement in terms of risk, though it does offer some improvement. The next factor, of course, you want to look at is the burden, right? Because we have to ask, would we say defendant is negligent in not taking these additional precautions? And we need to know the cost of the additional precautions, both in terms of money and in terms of lost utility. So in terms of cost, you want to contrast the cost of the existing conduct with the cost of the alternative conduct. And here are facts that you should use from the fact pattern to compare the additional costs triggered if we require Marvin to take the additional precautions. And here is our summary of that comparison. The alternative conduct, forcing him to use ceramic plates, will be much more expensive on an ongoing basis. Next, we want to see if there's any lost utility if we force defendant to use plates, not wax paper. We see two types of lost utility. One to customers, because if we say it's negligent to use wax paper, we're saying they can't shop easily and eat while they go around. They also lose food choice because 3 aisles are closed. Secondly, you should see a lost utility to Marvin because he's forced to abandon the uniqueness of his store. So you should use each of these facts to argue why there's a loss of utility if we conclude that Marvin had to use ceramic plates because use of wax would be negligent. And you should conclude that there's a significant loss of utility with the alternative. What do you conclude? You now need to wrap up all your risk utility analysis and give a very brief summary. Don't do it all over again. Don't introduce new facts. Simply a very brief summary of the above. A summary of what risks were posed, what the reduction in risk is, and what the burden in terms of cost and utility is. Again, a wrap-up conclusion which points out which way each of the factors pushes. Finally, and many of you will not have addressed this issue, you can make an argument that you can prove breach here through custom. Notice the strategy. A little time on custom as the facts are in the question, but nowhere near the amount of time you should spend on the risk utility analysis. Plaintiff may want to argue there's a custom in the industry of not serving pizzas in the stores, but remember, outside the medical malpractice area, custom is only evidence of breach and is not itself the standard or measure of the breach. Secondly, it's not clear that we even have a custom, right? Because the custom appears to be about serving or not serving pizza, not what you serve it on. And secondly, this doesn't appear to be a safety custom. So for that reason, the custom argument is pretty weak, and you should mention and dismiss it in one paragraph. Then right at the end, you want to reach a general conclusion about whether there's a breach. And remember when I said at the beginning, whether you conclude there's a breach or conclude there's not a breach is not as important as the quality and depth of your argument, a topic I'll turn to next. If you give this to someone else to grade for you, then I suggest you also ask them to explain 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses so that you can see what to improve in your answer. What I want to suggest to you is that there are several things that most of you probably have to work on. One is organization of your answer. Do you clearly address each different topic in a different paragraph? Secondly, rule statements. Do you have clear rule statements that you can apply as you work through breach? Remember, in breach, in the risk utility test, the rule statements are the factors. So for instance, a rule statement would be that we look at the probability and gravity of the injury to ascertain risk. The last thing I really want to focus on, and something you should be thinking about for all your classes, is analysis. How do you write and grade analysis? So focusing on analysis requires you to apply the given facts to the rule of law. You can't just state a conclusion on the issue, and you have to do more than simply point out the facts. Rather, you have to expressly explain why the facts show the rule is met or not met. Remember, you need sentences that link the facts to the rule. Let me give you a few examples. So let's consider the discussion which is on the top of the back page of the grading guide on burden, and particularly the costs attributed to the alternative conduct. So suppose they simply identified this factor and said we must look at the burden posed by the alternative conduct, including its cost. And suppose their analysis is just this sentence in blue. Here the ceramic plates would be very costly burden on Marvin. Do you realize this is simply a conclusion, not analysis? The writer doesn't consider all of the facts in coming to the conclusion, and it doesn't even have a subrule. So let's try a better version. Suppose they had written, we must examine the comparative costs of the alternative conduct. Here the ceramic plates are more expensive than waxed paper. Notice this is a better answer. You have a subrule right here that to assess burden we have to look at the comparative cost of the alternative conduct, but we still simply have a statement of the facts. So do you see, this is simply a restatement of relevant facts, not analysis. The ceramic plates are more expensive than wax paper. That's a factual statement. It isn't expressly linked. In addition, it does not contain all the facts we would like an answer to use. Take a moment, pause this video, and read through this answer. You should realize that while the end is still conclusory, we're getting closer to analysis, although the writer does not explain why she reaches some of the conclusions. So the first paragraph here is pretty good, right? It's explaining why the cost increases. Is it a high, low cost? However, when it gets to the alternative conduct, it's pretty summative. Let's try one more time. This is what real analysis looks like. So we've already told the reader, this is expanding just the second paragraph about the alternative conduct. So can you see that each paragraph raises a new fact, explains why it's significant as to cost, and then links it back to the role, continuing loss of revenue. Equally, the next paragraph, it identifies another set of facts which show additional cost, and we link it back to the role, additional labor costs. Finally, the last paragraph ties these concepts together, right? Ceramic plates are more costly than wax paper that Marvin used before. In addition, some plates will break and he'll have to pay for replacement costs. There should then be a conclusion which wraps up your comparison. That set of analysis shows you what depth you're aiming for when you go for a factor. Remember, we just looked at cost. Each of the issues you should provide the same amount of factual and legal analysis for. And remember, your overarching goal when running risk utility is to simply compare the existing conduct, which we're arguing is negligent, with the alternative conduct that we are arguing the defendant should have taken. Always remember that you're writing to convince a jury. You need to take it step by step, baby steps, and thoroughly explain your thinking so a jury could follow and agree with you. Finally, I want you to reflect on what you did. What are you going to change? What did you change from when you did the last midterm? Did it work? Do you need to make further refinements in how you outline and how you take notes? Thinking ahead. One erroneous conclusion students sometimes draw is that they believe that breach has to be complex. It is true that in this fact pattern, breach was complex. However, breach can also be very, very simple. For instance, if I step into the road without looking, I pose a high risk of being hit by a car, so a significant probability of serious injury. My alternative conduct would simply be stop, look, and listen, looking both ways, and that would decrease my risk significantly and eliminate any chance of injury, and the burden would be a simple requirement that I take more precautions before stepping into the road. So don't come away from this exercise concluding that breach is always complex. Sometimes it requires in-depth analysis. Sometimes it's one paragraph to show that the defendant's or the plaintiff's conduct lacked reasonable care. Finally, I was hoping that you all spotted, although the question did not require you to address, that there was a duty issue. Plaintiff was suing because he was injured by slipping on the floor. Therefore, this is a premises liability question. So in duty, you should have analyzed that the plaintiff, Robin, was an invitee on defendant Marvin's land, and therefore defendant Marvin owed her a duty of reasonably safe premises, i.e. reasonable care as to the condition of her premises. I did not ask you to address that duty question in this exercise, but if you had been asked to address the duty issue, you should spot that it is a premises liability problem. As you know, we're moving on to causation, and we will do an exercise on proximate cause. So remember the next step, your next option. Your next option is, if you rewrite, submit the original and your rewrite with an explanation of what you changed. Then I will review it. I hope this was helpful to you. Any questions, please post on Twen. Thanks.